Putin is in a panic over the possibility of a coup and being removed from power. There is a sense of panic in the Kremlin as they are running out of cards to keep playing the game. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump is tightening the screws on Russia with new sanctions. This is reported by The Telegraph, which notes that the position of the Russian Federation is beginning to weaken. The fact that paranoia in the Kremlin has intensified is also evidenced by the recent accusation by Russia's FSB against Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who now lives in London, and 22 members of the Russian anti-war committee, alleging they were preparing a coup d'état. They have been charged with violent seizure of power and the creation of a terrorist organization. The grounds for these accusations were the declaration adopted in Berlin in 2023 by the Russian Anti-War Committee, as well as the creation of a platform for Russian democratic forces at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. According to the Security Service, Khodorkovsky presents this platform to Western countries as a constituent assembly for a transitional period and as an alternative to the authorities of the Russian Federation. Experts describe such actions as a manifestation of Putin's new sense of vulnerability. Former US Ambassador to Ukraine John Herbst noted,
"The Kremlin is paranoid. Putin is looking for enemies to strengthen his regime."
According to the expert, Putin is being overly cautious. In his words, the FSB's accusations indicate the Kremlin's fear regarding a transfer of power. After all, in the event of Putin's death, there is no obvious successor.
The prime minister appointed by Putin, the courts and parliaments, all of whose legitimacy is questionable. This is the reality of Russia.
Experts also note that the international legitimacy of the Russian opposition could become a key factor in the event of a sudden change of power. That is precisely why the Kremlin is trying to discredit and intimidate the anti-war committee. Since coming to power, Putin has systematically eliminated those who oppose him, writes The Telegraph, recalling Yevgeny Prigozhin, who tried to march on Moscow by force. He was defeated and his uprising failed.
This is not a military coup. This is a peaceful march for justice, for fairness.
Putin is also afraid of his own generals, according to opposition figure Mikhail Khodorkovsky. The war has been going on for 3.5 years, yet the names of the so-called heroes are kept quiet.
The main reason, in my opinion, is that the Kremlin is pathologically afraid of popular military commanders. They are afraid that someone like a Bonaparte will suddenly emerge from the ranks of the army and, following Prigozhin's example, turn the troops in a completely different direction.
Meanwhile, Russia's economy is beginning to collapse. The Ministry of Economic Development has warned the country is on the verge of recession. According to Thomas Keating from the Royal United Services Institute, Russia's economic weakness could prompt external players to take more active measures. Experts claim that China's leader Xi Jinping could stop the war and bring down the Russian Federation's economy if he wanted to. The main buyers of Russian oil, India and China, have already reduced their purchases in response to the US decision on sanctions. This could result in Putin's war machine losing its most crucial source of income. Moreover, the war is affecting people all over the country near Russian oil refineries. After attacks by Ukrainian drones, plumes of smoke rise into the air. This leads to a sharp spike in gasoline prices and a fuel shortage.
The Russian dictator Vladimir Putin will lose the war, and Russia's situation is becoming increasingly desperate. This is what political scientist Mark Brolin writes in an article for The Telegraph. According to him, because of the war unleashed against Ukraine, Russia is increasingly turning into a vassal of China. Having lost Western oil markets, the country has achieved only partial control over Ukrainian territory at the cost of enormous human and economic losses. At the same time, Europe and the United States are acting in concert. EU countries are strengthening their defense sector and reducing their dependence on Russian energy, and American sanctions have increased pressure on the occupier's oil sector. Fearing secondary sanctions, Chinese and Indian companies have reduced their purchases of Russian oil. According to the author of the article, the myth of Russia as a great power is close to being debunked. Mark Brolin concludes that Russia cannot wage war forever, and to bring peace closer, pressure on the aggressor country must be increased. Recently, the Ukrainian armed forces have been successfully attacking military factories and oil refining facilities on Russian territory. In addition, the defense forces have achieved certain successes on the front line, despite the enemy's active attacks. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has confirmed the liberation of 2 settlements in Donbas, Kucheryav Yar and Puketsky. Soon it became known that the defense forces had liberated another settlement, Zatishok. According to reports from the General Staff, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia's losses have amounted to 1,139,000 Russian soldiers.
Russian leader Vladimir Putin has found himself in a dead end in the war against Ukraine. Despite prolonged fighting, the Kremlin has no idea how to achieve victory and is only accumulating problems. This is written by Edward Carr, deputy editor of The Economist. He notes that if the war continues until June 2026, it will surpass the First World War in duration. Carr draws a historical parallel. The Allies were able to break through German positions. In 1918, just as today, Ukraine continues to resist, while Russia does not know how to gain the upper hand. In his opinion, a dictator who lacks a theory of victory inevitably accumulates risks. Petro Oleshchuk, political scientist and lecturer at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, is now live with us in the studio. Welcome, Mr. Petro.
Thank you.
So Putin has found himself at a dead end in the war against Ukraine. The fighting continues. He doesn't know how to win, as analysts report in their article. But can he actually stop? Because he has to take into account both political and social risks. The entire army that's now fighting at the front could return and potentially overthrow Putin himself.
I think he himself is convinced that in the end he will defeat everyone. He regularly receives such reports. He's used to ignoring the state of the economy because he believes it's unimportant compared to the global goals he's pursuing. I am more than certain that he regularly receives information from his, let's say, ministers, and generally from people who have contact with him about certain problems in the economy. That it would be better to wrap up this war, but most likely he doesn't listen to anyone because he has become completely convinced that he must achieve victory, that this is some kind of decisive, extremely important, significant war, and so on. At the same time, again, I think that right now there are many directions in which the timing is being determined. Still, perhaps Putin's position will change depending on certain objective circumstances that even he will not be able to ignore. What do I mean by that? Well, of course, it's the sanctions. It's clear that the sanctions have not fully achieved the objectives set for them due to sanctions evasion and because they have often been rather half-hearted and inconsistent in many respects. But in my opinion, their impact is less significant. And the recorded largest discount on Russian oil in a year demonstrates that, in principle, sanctions against Russian oil companies are not just empty words. The next sanctions are being imposed by Ukrainian special services. In particular, today's latest operation carried out by the SBU, the GUR, and other relevant agencies, I mean the attack on the port in Novorossiysk. This is a very telling story, which, by the way, has already had an impact even on the global oil market. Prices have risen there, and many see this as a risk for Ukraine. But if prices rise not because of Russian oil, then frankly we don't care. It's clear to us that in the near future, Russia won't be able to use this terminal to export oil. And this is one example of the kind of sanctions that Ukraine is directly imposing with its drones. And with other appropriate means, and this also works in a certain way. So one way or another, sooner or later, even the Russian dictator obsessed with the war against Ukraine will be forced to admit that something needs to be done about this because the risks to his regime will continue to grow. I agree that he probably sees ending the war as a risk to his regime, especially in the context of soldiers returning home and in general, that this mobilization of society will immediately disappear. But on the other hand, continuing the war will also carry certain risks. And so once again, I can't say when the idea that ending it is actually easier will prevail, because the Russian leadership does not always act based on rational reasons or motives. Nevertheless, all these factors inevitably have an impact in the end.
Mr. Petro, we have just a minute left to talk. What domestic political scenarios are possible for Russia if the war drags on?
Well, again, it's quite difficult to predict Russian politics because it is closed off and non-public. It's clear that Putin's paranoia, which is widely discussed, did not arise out of nowhere. After all, we can recall the attempted Prigozhin mutiny. So I assume that his paranoia will continue to grow, and at the same time, the risks of a real coup will also increase because, in the end, all of this affects the pockets of specific individuals. The fact that Russians are dying there or that something is connected to this doesn't concern anyone in the Russian elite at all. But the fact that someone is directly touching their income, I think that will worry many of them one way or another. And again, even the Russian dictator won't be able to ignore this. But I repeat, he obviously tends to rely more on his own ideas about history or his own vision of history rather than on rational arguments. That's why it's quite difficult to predict. It's enough to recall that, for example, the entire American School of Criminology was unable to predict the collapse of the USSR. And this, in my opinion, is quite telling.
Mr. Petro, thank you. Petro Oleshchuk, political scientist and lecturer at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, was live with us in the studio.